Flashcards.
Flashcards. Flashcards. Flashcards.
Flashcards.
You're preparing for an exam and there's all this information that you need to retain. And every study expert and student out there is telling you that flashcards are the way to go because it's this awesome method of active learning. It's sometimes referred to as active recall and spaced repetition, and flashcards or solutions that enable this, such as Anki, are supposed to be one of the best ways to practice this learning method. Except it's not. And as someone who coaches thousands of students around the world, I will explain to you exactly why flashcards are misused by almost everyone and what you can do instead. But first, let me explain why. Just imagine for a second that as the volume of information you need to learn increases, the only way to keep up is to create thousands of flashcards, which is highly impractical in itself. On top of that, you're told that you should always be putting information into your flashcards. If it's not on your flashcards, it's not in your mind. Again, incredibly impractical when you have to write a flashcard for every new piece of information. And if you realize that having thousands of flashcards can take an extraordinarily long time, you might try and download pre-made decks, which in itself is limiting because most of the learning actually happens when you're creating your flashcards. Now, here's the most important thing to understand. If you are using flashcards to try to understand information, then I'm sorry to say that there will be limitations to that. And that's because flashcards are essentially just a slightly more advanced way to memorize information. You're learning information in isolation and you're not looking at how information comes together to form this bigger picture. And the truth is that exams are now testing your ability beyond memorizing, which in Bloom's taxonomy is the lowest order of learning. Instead, they're testing your ability to apply, to analyze, to evaluate, and these are also known as the higher orders of thinking skills required for higher order learning. Because of the lower order nature of flashcards as a technique, your brain doesn't hold on to that information very well. When information is at this lower order, it ends up not being very connected to many other ideas, and therefore your brain doesn't see it as very relevant to hold on to. And then when information itself is not made relevant, your brain doesn't bother dedicating the extra energy to remember that information in the future. And so this means that you just end up forgetting that information more easily. So if you've been trying to use flashcards and you're feeling like it's going through one ear and out the other, this is the exact reason why. For example, you probably don't remember the number plate of the first car that you saw on last Monday because there was no meaning or connection to it. But if by some chance you witnessed a car accident at that time, you probably would remember the number plate now because there's now that extra relevance and meaning attached to it, because you're now going to have to go ahead and report that to the authorities. See what I'm getting at here? So what should you be doing instead? Should you still use flashcards? The answer is yes. Flashcards still play a part in your learning, but only in specific and more limited use cases. So in the rest of this video, I'll be sharing the 3 steps you can take to help you retain and learn information more easily while reducing your reliance on flashcards altogether. All right, let's get into it. First, focus on relational prioritized learning. Second, use flashcards for information that must be memorized. And then finally, integrate interleaving into your revision. Let's tackle the first step, relational prioritized learning. Now, what is relational prioritized learning? I won't go deep into it in this video because we actually have a super in-depth explanation in another one of our videos here on this channel. But I highly recommend watching that video first if you haven't already, because of how important it is as a first step to reduce how much revision you're going to need to fill in all the knowledge gaps you might have before your exam. So be sure to check that out as soon as you can. But very quickly, relational prioritized learning is essentially a note-taking method, which focuses on how different ideas are connected to each other and how they fit together into a bigger picture. Once you've learned how to apply relational prioritized learning, you'll see that it's a much superior technique to flashcards for learning the majority of content that you need to study. So basically, instead of using flashcards, use relational prioritized learning as your main studying engine. You can then use flashcards for the other information which can't fit into relational prioritized learning. But naturally, you might be asking yourself, hey Archer, well, What kinds of information don't fit into relational prioritized learning? What kinds of information should I put onto flashcards? And that's step number 2. Only use flashcards for information that is isolated or very loosely related to other facts and ideas. If you rely on flashcards to learn 80 to 90 or even 100% of your content, then studying becomes too overwhelming because of the sheer number of flashcards to revise. Flashcards also create this tendency to only learn information in isolation instead of understanding how the information all connects to and links with one another. However, this is not to say that flashcards are worthless. Flashcards are an effective studying tool only when used correctly. Flashcards should only be used for memorizing very specific details that cannot be connected with any other bits of information, such as random facts or statistics. Other examples of isolated information may be significant dates and years, specific constants in physics or maths, or highly specific names of certain species. And yes, these pesky bits, they do exist, but they are a minority. For example, if you need to remember that the constant of gravitational acceleration is 9.80665 meters squared, and yeah, sure, you need to memorize that 80665, that specific constant of gravity is isolated, in that it cannot really be related to any other concept. This is not to be mistaken with the concept of gravity. So 9.80665 meters squared goes onto the flashcards. However, something like how gravity relates to acceleration, that can be done through relational prioritized learning. So the relationship between gravity and acceleration should not be on flashcards. If you used flashcards from the start, you'd be left with an enormous deck of cards in comparison to a very selective filtering process where only very specific isolated details end up on your flashcards. And that will just leave you with way less to do, or possibly even none. Once you've filtered what information should go into your flashcards, step number 3 kicks in, and that is to integrate interleaving during your revision. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to explain to you what interleaving is, why interleaving is important, and then I'm going to teach you how to use interleaving into your own studies. So what is interleaving? Well, interleaving is basically viewing and testing many pieces of information from multiple angles. And if you try and condense all of these angles onto flashcards, it is downright impossible unless you want to create literally an unlimited number of flashcards. And so why is interleaving important? Well, interleaving is important because it is the last piece of the studying puzzle which relational prioritized learning and flashcards do not cover. And since most exams and assessments test your ability to look at pieces of information from multiple angles, you would need to be able to handle and generate all of these different angles for each piece of information that you're going to be learning. If you do not engage in the appropriate methods of interleaving, this can result in having huge gaps in your understanding and in your mastery over the content that you've tried to be studying. And this is problematic because the gaps in your knowledge can result in lower performance in your assessments. If you've ever fallen victim to those curveball questions during your assessments, you know, those questions that you're just unable to answer because they're too tricky, right? This is usually caused by insufficient interleaving during your revision. So now that you understand why interleaving is so important, how do you use interleaving in your own studies? To know how you should use interleaving in your own studies, there are 2 things that you first need to identify. Firstly, identify the types of knowledge your assessments will require you to learn. And then secondly, identify the order of retrieval you will require during your assessments to do well. Once you have identified the type of knowledge and the order of retrieval you require for your exam, then you will have an idea of what interleaving techniques you should be using during your revision. First, let's take a look at the types of knowledge you need to know for your assessments. And there are really 2 broad categories this can be broken up to. And if we understand what type of knowledge we're aiming to learn, we can select a better optimized interleaving technique for that type of knowledge. There is declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is information that is based on facts, concepts, or logic. For example, think history, law, language, grammar rules. These subjects or topics often have a huge focus on remembering hard facts. On the other hand, we have procedural knowledge. Procedural knowledge is the knowledge of how to perform skills or procedures. And examples of these include subjects like maths, physics, or accounting. And this is because you often have to apply equations or derive and solve equations, which are all multi-step processes. It's important to note though that subjects are a mix of both procedural and declarative knowledge. For example, physics has a blend of procedural and declarative knowledge. You may have to understand complex physics concepts and formulas to answer some theory-heavy questions, and this counts as declarative knowledge. But the bulk of your exam will likely test your problem-solving ability in actually using those equations, and that counts as procedural knowledge. While subjects are a mix of procedural and declarative knowledge, they normally skew towards one more than the other. For example, physics is more procedural than declarative, since most of the questions will be testing your ability to work through a problem as a process and calculate a specific answer as a number. Whereas a subject like history for younger students might be more declarative as it focuses more on regurgitating facts and descriptions of events. At this point of the video, I encourage you to take some time to list out all the subjects that you have upcoming and the corresponding ratios of knowledge for those subjects. For example, for a subject like physics, the balance between declarative and procedural knowledge may be 40 to 60. Where maybe 40% of the content that you will learn are facts, concepts, and logic, and 60% of the content are equations, procedures, and derivations. And for history, the balance between declarative and procedural knowledge may be 80 to 20, where 80% of the content are facts, events, and dates, and 20% of the content are procedural, where you really just have to have this strong method to writing an essay. So pause this video right now and take some time to list out those subjects and their ratios. And secondly, regardless of the type of knowledge, there are different orders to which you can recall and retrieve this information at. And if we know what order of retrieval is required for our assessments, we can select an interleaving technique that can better prepare us to use that knowledge in the way that it's needed for that assessment. There are also two broad categories here that we can use to allow us to understand these orders of retrieval. And these two orders are lower orders of retrieval and higher orders of retrieval. Assessments that require lower orders of retrieval test the ability of students to be able to recall isolated facts, details, and information. And during the earlier stages of education, or even during in some declaratively heavy subjects such as anatomy, there are assessments that just test you only on lower order retrieval. And you can have this in any subject. It's still like physics. You might get some questions that only really test your ability to recall a certain concept or fact as is. As an example might be, what is Newton's first law of motion? Or another example in anatomy could be, what is the cranial nerve that is responsible for sensing blood pressure changes in the carotid body and sinus? These questions only require the regurgitation and recall of basic facts, and this is lower order retrieval. On the other hand, we have higher order retrieval. Assessments that require higher orders of retrieval, they test the ability of students to be able to fluidly apply, compare and contrast, integrate and evaluate different concepts between one another. And during the later stages of education, especially in competitive curriculums, assessments tend to test higher order retrieval more. And for example, coming back to physics again, you may get a certain question that tests your ability to integrate your knowledge from many different subtopics, right? Just looking at the relationships that are involved and then therefore being able to create the solution to a novel problem. For example, on a smooth, flat conveyor belt moving at a consistent speed, a pencil suddenly stands on its point without falling. Making reference to Newton's first law and third law, explain how this phenomenon could or could not occur. For this question, instead of just recalling a formula or stating a law, you need to understand the multiple principles that are required to come together to arrive at a certain solution. So I want you to take a look again at that list that you've written. I want you also now to consider for each of your subjects where there's going to be more lower order or more higher order retrieval required. And again, a lot of the time, it's going to be a mix. An easy way of understanding the order of retrieval required for each of your subjects is just by taking a look at the syllabus, the learning outcomes that you're required to do well in the assessment, and you'll see mostly where they're asking you to just recall information or just understand things in isolation, versus if they're requiring you to compare and contrast and see how all these ideas relate to one another. So again, if it's just asking you to recall and regurgitate, it's mostly lower order of retrieval. And then if it's not that, it's going to be higher order where it's making you do this much more complicated thinking. So now that you have an understanding of the types of knowledge and the orders of retrieval that there are for knowledge, you should understand that you can make 4 combinations with these. And then based on this, you can use certain interleaving techniques that optimize on each of those categories. These are declarative knowledge at lower orders, declarative knowledge at higher orders, procedural knowledge at lower orders, and procedural knowledge at higher orders. And now we're going to go through some examples of some interleaving techniques that you can use that fit into each of these categories. Let's start with declarative topics, and the interleaving techniques that you can use here. These are typically perfect for topics like anatomy, biology, history, or any theory component of the topics that you are studying. So for declarative knowledge retrieved at lower orders, you will be focusing on the facts, the concepts, the logic that there is. And since your assessments only require lower order retrieval, you will only be required to simply understand and apply basic concepts. And you may be even required to just memorize certain bits of information. And if you recall, interleaving is the process of viewing and testing a piece of information from multiple angles. However, because you only need to engage in memorizing facts and understanding small details, the interleaving techniques here will not be as in-depth or as extensive because they don't need to be. So to master the lower orders of declarative knowledge, you can use a simple teaching technique like just teaching it to an imaginary 10-year-old of all of the stuff that you've learned so far. And while doing this, just make sure that you're not referring to your notes. You're trying to recall the information from your mind and simplify it down to the best of your ability for that imaginary 10-year-old. This technique is useful for testing your basic understanding of the topic and just giving you an opportunity to recall any details that you may need to memorize. Now for declarative knowledge retrieved at a higher order, you will now need to fluidly apply, compare, contrast, integrate, and evaluate different concepts in different unfamiliar contexts. And so as a result, the interleaving techniques you will need to apply, they will need to be in-depth and integrative. So to master the higher orders of declarative knowledge, you can create evaluative and challenging questions to really test your ability to connect certain concepts. And so during your revision sessions, you can refer to your notes and deliberately create these complex integrative questions that you do not know the answer to immediately. So for example, you might look at your physics notes and you see that you have forces, energy, and heat. And a challenge question you could create to combine all those things together could be, using Newton's laws, explain how energy from a car collision could result in an increase or decrease of heat energy present in the vehicles before the collision. This question could catch anyone out during an exam. These challenge questions, they are helpful for higher orders of declarative knowledge, even if the question itself doesn't make much sense to you initially. And this is because this is really taking you to that higher gear of thinking, really thinking about how the concepts are interconnected and related with one another. And when you start doing this, you start thinking in a way that the examiner might be even creating the questions for your exam. And so you can even start to predict these questions. So now let's take a look at how this process of interleaving would look for more procedurally focused topics. And this can be for topics like physics, maths, accounting, economics, or any procedural component of the topics that you are studying. So for procedural knowledge retrieved at lower orders, you will be focusing on procedures, processes, and steps. And since your assessments will only require you to have this lower order retrieval, then just a basic grasp of these procedures is enough. To master the lower orders of procedural knowledge, you can use basic practice problems and just change up the variables. For example, in physics, after you've done a basic practice problem based on F equals ma, reflect on what would happen if the value of m was higher or if the value of a was higher. So just doing those common practice problems is an easy way of doing this at a lower order, as well as just playing around with those variables and seeing what happens. And for the part of your assessments that now require procedural knowledge at higher orders, You now need to fluidly adjust, derive, and evaluate how you can use certain procedures in various contexts. Just like we did for the higher order declarative example, we're actually going to use the same evaluative and challenge question here. But the difference is now that it's more procedurally focused. So for example, the question could be, calculate the initial velocity and launch angle needed to successfully launch a ball into a basket placed 5 meters away horizontally and 2 meters above the ground. Assume the ball is 2.3 kilograms and is launched from the ground. Assume that the ball is affected by air resistance as it travels. To solve this question, you would need to integrate your knowledge of horizontal and vertical motion, use the equations of motion. You have to understand how to break down forces and vectors into these axes to solve this problem. And also air resistance is part of the matter as well. And again, even if the question doesn't make sense, the process of creating this question and trying to solve it is what gives most of the learning. Another side benefit is that this is really going to get you thinking about the concepts, the processes, the equations, and how they are all interrelated with each other. Now do note from these 4 examples that we have given, there are definitely way more interleaving techniques that you could be using. And you might even find yourself using number 2 or 3 or even all of them, and that is perfectly normal. You will find yourself needing to mix and match these interleaving techniques as you go through your interleaving sessions, your revision sessions, and this is because one interleaving technique is not enough to cover all of these categories. But at the end of the day, by intentionally incorporating many different interleaving techniques for these specific needs of your subjects, you'll be much more exam ready and prepared. Okay, so as a recap, here are the 3 steps. Number 1, apply relational prioritized learning, connect those concepts and ideas together. Number 2, use flashcards only to hold loosely related or isolated pieces of information. And number 3, use interleaving to view, consider pieces of information from these many different angles, and to make your revision process much more bulletproof and to even anticipate questions in your upcoming exams. And if you want a PDF that has this recap, you can download that from the description below. And if you know anyone who's still using flashcards or revising for an exam, make sure to let them know about this video if you think it's going to help them out. And then like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.